m'entend. Je suis désolé d'interrompre ce petit déjeuner fort sympathique, mais j'ai quelques mots à vous dire avant de laisser la parole à notre invité de ce matin, Monsieur Steve Maijoor. Donc, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, chers amis, c'est avec un immense plaisir que je vous revois ce matin pour notre premier petit déjeuner de rentrée. J'espère que pour chacune et chacun d'entre vous, ces quelques semaines de vacances auront été bénéfiques en tout point et vous auront permis de prendre un petit peu de distance par rapport à un environnement économique européen et surtout français particulièrement pesant, pour ne pas dire inquiétant. Bref, je souhaite qu'elle vous ait permis, encore une fois, de faire le plein d'énergie afin d'affronter au mieux nos nombreux dossiers de rentrée. Ce matin, nous avons le plaisir donc d'accueillir M. Steve Maijoor, qui a souhaité nous entretenir des rapports entre régulation et stabilité financière. Je m'excuse, Monsieur le Président, je m'étais renseigné, on m'avait dit que je pouvais faire mon discours d'introduction en français. J'espère par conséquent que vous n'aurez pas de problème pour comprendre l'ensemble de ces propos. Je vous fais donc confiance, Monsieur Steve Maijoor, pour traiter ce thème avec enthousiasme, voire allégresse. Exercice délicat, car réguler, auditer, contrôler, voire sanctionner ne sont pas des actions qui réjouissent d'emblée les responsables des structures concernées. Mais avant de vous laisser la parole, Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi de vous dire quelques mots concernant la vie de notre association. Alors tout d'abord, je dois rappeler que le 30 avril dernier, l'AFTE, aux côtés d'autres associations financières, a participé de manière très forte et très impliquée à la signature de la charte EuroPP en présence du ministre des Finances, M. Michel Sapin. Toujours sur ce thème, j'ai le plaisir de vous annoncer que le 13 mars 2015, donc dans quelques mois, notre association, à travers son vice-président Hervé Labbé, co-organisera avec Paris Europlace la journée de l'EuroPP. Donc plusieurs centaines de participants y sont d'ores et déjà attendus. S'agissant des travaux menés par les commissions, je rappellerai d'abord que la commission juridique est pilotée par Alexandra Cavi et M. Bruno Fichmouras a, à la suite de problèmes rencontrés par une grande banque de la place, alerté nos adhérents sur la conduite à tenir lorsque des demandes d'informations émanant de l'OFAC, c'est-à-dire donc l'Office of Foreign Assets Control, est reformulée par des banques lors des due deals préalables à toute opération financière impliquant les États-Unis. Par ailleurs, je vous indique également que la commission monétique dirigée par M. Le Sobre vient de mettre un point final à la charte des bonnes pratiques à destination des commerçants acceptant les paiements en ligne. Donc c'est un document technique actuellement entre les mains du groupement Carte Bleue avant diffusion auprès de l'ensemble des acteurs intéressés, nos adhérents. Alors s'agissant des délégations régionales, je rappelle, Monsieur le Président, que l'AFTE est constituée non seulement d'un noyau dur en Île-de-France, mais également nous avons 9 délégations régionales. Je me permets de vous rappeler que le 23 mai dernier, la délégation Rhône-Alpes, qui est supervisée par Madame Pouillet, a organisé en copartenariat avec Lyon Place Financière, la DFCG et la CCI de Rhône-Alpes, un séminaire sur le thème « Optimiser, automatiser et sécuriser sa trésorerie » qui aura permis de rassembler de nombreux experts financiers de la région. Je rappelle également que le 25 septembre prochain à Rouen se tiendra la soirée de prestige organisée par notre délégation Normandie-Bretagne en collaboration avec le Crédit Mutuel Arkea. Ce sera entre autres l'occasion d'écouter Madame Saliou, qui est responsable économique chez Arkea, qui interviendra sur le thème « Divergence croissante entre les politiques monétaires des banques centrales, quel impact pour les marchés ?» Tout un programme. En outre, mi-septembre, l'AFTE sera présente à Abidjan pour participer à la commémoration des 10 ans de l'AFTE UEMOA, donc c'est l'équivalent de l'AFTE, mais donc en Afrique de l'Ouest, et qui regroupe plusieurs dizaines de trésoriers et financiers en Afrique de l'Ouest. Enfin, je ne peux m'empêcher de terminer ce petit tour d'horizon sans vous rappeler que les 18 et 19 novembre prochains se tiendront au Palais Brognard les désormais fameuses journées de l'AFTE, Nous aurons le plaisir d'accueillir deux invités d'honneur. Le premier jour sera introduit par M. Xavier Fontanet, ex-président directeur général des Scillers. Et la deuxième journée sera introduite par M. François Perrol, président de la BPCE. Et puis, j'en profite également pour vous annoncer que notre prochain petit déjeuner se tiendra ici même le 4 décembre prochain. Et nous aurons le plaisir, là aussi, d'accueillir Madame Nicole Nota, qui est présidente de Vigéo, agence spécialisée dans la mesure de la responsabilité sociale, élément devenu de plus en plus important, entre autres à travers les émissions de Green Bond. J'en arrive donc à notre hôte de ce matin, M. Steve Maijoor, que je vais essayer de vous présenter en quelques mots. Je dois vous dire qu'il m'a fallu beaucoup de temps et de patience pour arriver à collationner quelques informations. Donc vous êtes d'une discrétion absolument remarquable, ce qui n'a pas facilité ma tâche. Bon, bref, après des investigations poussées, j'en suis arrivé, M. Maijoor, à la conclusion simple que vous êtes un apatride, un citoyen du monde, un homme aux semelles de vent, comme aurait dit Rimbaud. En effet, vous êtes né en 1964 à Hong Kong, d'un père qui travaillait pour une compagnie maritime, et après 6 années passées en Afrique du Sud, vous partez pour les Pays-Bas. Et lors de vacances scolaires, chaque fois que vous en aurez l'occasion, vous partirez rejoindre votre père pour explorer tantôt l'Amérique du Sud, tantôt l'Asie. Très jeune, vous serez attiré, pour ne pas dire fascinated, par l'économie, et c'est la raison pour laquelle vous décidez d'aller poursuivre vos études à l'université de Groningue, très réputée en ce domaine. C'est là que vous vous intéressez de manière très poussée au comportement des marchés financiers et que vous commencerez à réfléchir à des règles permettant de les encadrer sans annihiler l'espace de liberté dont les acteurs ont besoin pour opérer. Après des études approfondies en finance et en économie, vous êtes diplômé de l'université de Groningue et vous avez obtenu en 1991 un PhD en économie, comptabilité financière et audit à l'université de Maastricht. Vous débutez votre carrière professionnelle en tant que professeur. Vous enseignerez d'abord à l'université de Californie du Sud tout en étant maître de conférences à l'université de Maastricht. Puis vous deviendrez professeur attitré à la School of Business and Economics de Maastricht, où vous enseignerez la comptabilité, l'audit et le controlling. Finalement, en 2001, à l'âge de 37 ans, vous serez nommé doyen de l'université de Maastricht, supervisant une équipe de plus de 400 personnes et un campus sur lequel évoluent plus de 5000 étudiants. Vous publierez également de nombreux articles dans des revues prestigieuses qui analysent les rapports entre comptabilité, marché financier, organisation dans le sens économique du terme, et la société dans son acception politique. En avril 2004, suite à un appel téléphonique de M. Arthur Doctors van Leuven, homme politique d'obédience libérale et président de l'autorité des marchés financiers des Pays-Bas, récemment créée, vous décidez de le rejoindre en qualité de directeur financier, plus particulièrement en charge du suivi de l'intégrité des marchés financiers. En parallèle, vous serez nommé membre du CESR, Committee of European Securities Regulators, prédécesseur de l'ESMA, pendant 3 ans. À partir de juillet 2010, vous serez membre éminent du groupe de travail qui, au sein de l'IFRS, sera plus particulièrement en charge des sujets de gouvernance. Et en avril 2009, vous êtes nommé président de l'International Forum of Independent Audit Regulators. Bref, à travers ce rapide panorama, on se rend bien compte que si vous êtes un homme du chiffre et de l'organisation, au sens de régulation, vous êtes aussi un homme du monde. Il était donc normal que, compte tenu de toutes ces compétences que vous synthétisez, vous soyez choisi par la Commission européenne pour être le premier patron de l'ESMA pour au moins 5 ans, et ce, à compter du 13 janvier 2011. Très vite, vous allez être confronté à toute une série de grands dossiers, parmi lesquels je citerai volontiers les bonus distribués aux traders, le comportement des agences de notation, la manipulation du Libor, la vente de titres à découvert. Bref, je suis sûr que vous n'en attendiez pas tant. À ce stade, je serais tenté de vous poser les questions suivantes. À quoi sert l'autorité européenne des marchés financiers? Comment ça fonctionne avec chacun des pays membres de l'Union européenne? Comment faire pour concilier régulation et croissance? Pensez-vous qu'une crise bancaire comme celle que nous avons connue en 2008 soit aujourd'hui totalement écartée? Estimez-vous disposer des moyens techniques et humains pour exercer convenablement votre rôle de superviseur? Comment positionnez-vous vos missions dans un contexte mondial? Bref, Monsieur Maijoor, je suis persuadé que votre intervention suscitera bien d'autres questions. I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, Philippe. And I think this is the first time that I've been introduced so lengthy at an event in the past 3 years. To some extent, it makes you a bit uncomfortable how much information there is on yourself on the internet. And I must say you've done an excellent job. But of course, it would be naive for me to think that that information would not be available on the internet. So it was good to hear a bit about the background. And indeed, I was born in Hong Kong, and I didn't have a background in markets. My parents were more from the maritime sector. But I can remember indeed that as a 10-year-old boy, I was really interested in financial markets, which is in itself, of course, a bit concerning that at that age you're interested in financial markets. And I followed the newspaper, and I could see the changes in the foreign exchange rates. And of course, a boy of 10 understands how currencies work. You don't understand how stocks work, how ownerships, how bonds work, but you understand how foreign exchange works. And that really started me at that age already to follow the exchange rates. And I understood that you could earn some money by possibly trading in foreign exchange. Subsequently, I went to the regulatory side later in my life, but indeed, my interest in financial markets was raised and at a very young age. I must say I'm very happy to speak here today at this event of AFTE. It is very good for me to have a discussion here and present for the treasurers. Treasurers are obviously very important for ESMA. A lot of the work that ESMA is doing is relevant for treasurers. I'm sure we will be talking about OTC derivatives. ESMA is very active in the area of financial reporting, IFRS, also mentioned by Philippe in the introduction. Credit rating agencies, regulated market, transparency on regulated markets are just a few examples where ESMA is active and which is very relevant, I think, to treasurers. I would also like to express how glad I am that we are based in Paris. Obviously, I should be a neutral chairman. I'm a European. I have no preferences for any country. But still, I'm really glad that I could cycle to my work here in Paris this morning. Cycling is the mode of transport in the Netherlands that I also apply here in Paris. It is just an enjoyable city, but also it has helped us to get the right type of human resources to ESMA, to get to be an attractive place for an organization to build. Because as you will understand, ESMA has been building its organization in the past 3 years. We have grown quite fast, and we had to attract people to our organization, and Paris has really been an asset for getting the right people and being an attractive employer for people working in ESMA. So again, I would like to emphasize that we're very happy to be based in Paris. What I would like to do in my contribution is I will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and I think probably to make it a bit more tailor-made and give ample possibility for questions from the floor and respond to the issues that are high on your list. But before we go to these question and answers, I would like to talk for about 20-25 minutes on the following issues. First, very briefly on ESMA. Where is ESMA? There's already been some introduction by the chairman, but I think I would like to briefly talk what has been developing at ESMA in the past years. Subsequently, I would talk about credit rating agencies. Their prominence on the agenda has been reducing a bit, but still I think they're extremely important for the functioning of markets. And it's also an area where there's been major changes in the financial markets, how they are regulated, the requirements for credit rating agencies, and how we use ratings. Thirdly, I will talk about shadow banking. This is a very difficult, but basically not the right term. And finally, I understand, which is very high on your list, is all the issues around OTC derivatives, and especially the international coordination of OTC derivatives regulation and supervision. And so these are the areas that I would like to talk with you. I just realized, preparing my remarks for this morning, that I didn't touch upon MiFID. MiFID 2, there might be questions on MiFID 2. I will briefly make a few comments on MiFID 2. EMIR on OTC derivatives was already a very big project for ESMA, and at that time, when we started really working on EMIR, I would say that the core of that was in last year. It was considered probably to be the biggest project at ESMA at this time. I must say MiFID 2 is even bigger, and that is not only for us, but also for you as market participants. And we fully understand the complexities for you to respond in time to our consultations. At the same time, you should realize we at our side also need to go through these consultations, and we have to work with deadlines proposed and required by our political leaders that we need to respect. Let me first then go to ESMA and talk a few minutes on ESMA. We were established in 2011, and we were basically the response to the first part of the financial crisis. And when we were established in 2011, that was still mainly a banking crisis. There was not yet at that time major issues with currencies. That seems to be a bit now more behind us. But we were established in response to the first part of the banking crisis. And we were the successor of CSER. And I always say that ESMA stands on the shoulders of CSER. CSER already accomplished a lot. Many of those who contributed to CSER are here in the audience. But I think also that ESMA really was a step change, or is a step change, compared to where CSER was. Our objectives as CSER, as ESMA and also CSER, are first of all, of course, investor protection, very classical role for securities markets regulators. And secondly, the one that I would like to mention is stability, and that is relatively new for securities markets regulators. Traditionally, securities markets regulators are very much focused on investor protection, transparency to the users, transparency to the retail investors, and less so much about stability. This stability, of course, is now in our objective because of the problems in this financial crisis, because there are issues now in securities markets which have strong stability concerns, like OTC derivatives, like possibly money market funds, like possibly high-frequency trading. But it also has implications for us in terms of collecting data. And as you will have seen with the various pieces of legislation, there's many more obligations now for both market participants to supply data to their national regulator or European regulator, and for us as ESMA to work on these data and try to identify the risks in financial markets. And so this stability objective is reflected in the pieces of legislation that you're seeing and the obligations that you are observing in terms of more data sharing with the regulators, making sure that we have the right data to understand what is happening in markets. ESMA in the past years has played a central role in the implementation of the so-called G20 commitments. G20 commitments are in essence the new coordination mechanism across countries to make sure that regulatory reform is coordinated across the world. And ESMA has played a central role, let's say, in the technical implementation of the G20 commitments for the EU. And just to give you some examples, the credit rating agencies' requirements were based on G20 commitments. The requirements for regulating and supervising hedge funds and private equity were based on G20 commitments. And obviously, again, the OTC derivatives requirements are based on the G20 requirements. Looking at where we are now in the regulatory reform, we have had many pieces of rules and regulations introduced in the past years. and there is this tendency to say the regulatory reform is getting to an end and it's time to move on. I think it's extremely important to realize is that making the rules is the first stage, making sure that they work in practice, that they are implemented and that they practically change business practices is a much longer process requiring intelligent application on the ground floor of these rules and regulations, but also requiring time to make the changes for the market participants. And so the idea is that the regulatory reform is over. I think it's extremely important to realize the real success of the regulatory reform also depends on the implementation. And to some extent, the implementation has just only started. Moving then to the tools that we have as ESMA and why we are able to play our role in this regulatory reform, I will just mention a few. First of all, ESMA now has the possibility to directly write technical standards that are directly applicable across the 28 member states. Our predecessors didn't have that powers, and the benefit of this, of course, is a real level playing field. And that is the reason that the technical standards which are now implemented for EMIR or for credit rating agencies or will be implemented for MiFID, they really result in a level playing field in terms of the single rulebook. We didn't have that possibility in the past, and we decide on these rules on the basis of majority voting. I think that is one of the fundamental changes of ESMA coming to existence and being active in financial markets. Secondly, of course, you can have a single rulebook across Europe, but if the individual regulators apply the rulebook differently, then you still don't have a truly single market. You still don't have a truly internal market. And I'm sure that many of the treasurers here around the table have had their experiences with other regulators of other countries, and they have experienced that there were that there were differences. There were differences in the way they looked at the same rules, the differences in the way they did the supervision of these rules. And it's important that regulators try to be as consistent as possible, trying really to achieve this single market, these internal markets. And ESMA has a number of instruments to achieve not only the single rulebook, the same rules, but also trying to achieve similar supervision resulting in the same outcomes. Then we now, of course, have the direct supervisory powers regarding credit rating agencies and trade repositories. I will mention that and discuss that briefly later on. And we have substantially increased our capabilities to analyze risks in financial markets, risks both to investor protection, both to stability. And this goes back to the point on the increased responsibility of securities markets regulators for stability. Very briefly on the organization, all decisions, all major decisions by my organization, by ESMA, are taken by the board of 28 national regulators, the heads of the national regulators, and so the AMF obviously is participating in our board, and Gérard Amex is representing the AMF on our board, and I can also say that the AMF is a very active contributor to the work of ESMA. And so in the end, all decisions, major decisions we're taking, is the result of the decision making by this board. Another characteristic, which I think is very important for you, is consultations are extremely important, and trying to get stakeholder feedback on our proposals is very much established in our organization. We have consultative working groups at standing committee levels. We have at the highest level in ESMA a advisory group, a securities markets advisory group, a stakeholder group that advises ESMA on for example, the consultations that we publish, and we really listen and read to these comments by the stakeholders. And if you follow some of the decisions we have taken in the past, you can see we have adjusted our decision making in response to the consultations that we were getting from the stakeholders. We currently have about 185 staff. We started about 40 in 2011, January 2011, and I think we have a very good mix of people with experience in supervision, people with experience in policy making, and people with experience directly coming from the markets and market practitioners. Let me now move on, considering also time, to the topic of credit rating agencies. Since 2011, ESMA is the sole regulator for credit rating agencies in the EU, and we supervise, basically as if we are a national regulator, the governance, independence and transparency of credit rating agencies. They were unregulated before the crisis, and I think with hindsight you can be surprised that they were unregulated considering the importance they have in our financial system. We even hardwired credit rating agencies in our financial system by being part of our rules and regulations, by being part of contracts, and that was the reason also on the basis of the performance of the credit rating agencies in the phase up to the crisis and the performance problems, to say that we need to regulate and supervise credit rating agencies. We now have more than 20 credit rating agencies registered with ESMA, but obviously they're the well-known 3 larger credit rating agencies and a larger group of medium-sized and small credit rating agencies, which I must say in some specific niche markets do compete with each other, both the larger ones and the smaller credit rating agencies. We don't rate the ratings. We're not a judger of the ratings, because of the independence, the importance of independence of the ratings themselves. We focus indeed on governance, transparency, and their independence, but not as such the rating of the ratings or judging the ratings. We've done a couple of reviews in the past year, or on-site inspections of the credit rating agencies on issues such as bank ratings, sovereign ratings, and the ratings by the smaller or medium-sized credit rating agencies. And we have seen in some instances that they do not yet meet the requirements of the regulations, and as you know, we can enforce when needed. And we have actually also in one case censured one of the larger credit rating agencies. Then on this point of the hardwiring of ratings, as I just said, we rely too much on credit rating agencies. That is not only an observation in Europe, that was part of these so-called G20 commitments, and so we need to reduce our reliance on ratings. We've chosen in Europe a balanced approach to this issue. The US has gone to the approach that there shouldn't be any reliance at all on credit ratings. We think it is important to still use it as an important piece of information when you make a credit judgment and filter that information into your judgment. So it's a combined approach of your own judgment on the credit quality and the reliance on the rating. And you see that philosophy reflected in the bank regulation, for example, CRD4, but also in changes to the asset management rules and regulations. You see this approach of both using the information coming from the ratings and using your own judgment. Generally, I think we need to reduce the reliance on ratings. On the other hand, they play an important role in financial markets and will continue to be important for financial markets. Then moving on to shadow banking. As I said already, we have this unhelpful term called shadow banking. The reality is that there is not much shadow anymore. Looking at the non-banking sector, most of the parts of the non-banking sector are now regulated and supervised. So talking about money market funds, hedge funds, off-balance sheet vehicles, securitizations, all these elements are in some way or another regulated by securities markets regulators. So a real shadow is not even there, is not anymore there, I would say. There's also a bit of a risk of extending this term of shadow banking too far and make the reach too far. There's some even saying that regular investment funds which invest in corporate bonds should be called the shadow banking sector, which I think is not the right approach and not the right way to look at the issues. The right way to look at these issues is to say we have, for most parts of the securities markets, rules and regulations. They are supervised. The question is it effectively supervised, and is there to some extent an unlevel playing field with other parts of the regulated sector, other parts of the financial sector? And we need to indeed look further where there might be possible gaps or white spots in the shadow banking system which we should regulate or supervise or get more information on. The flip side, of course, of the shadow banking sector, or the other side, is that it's also an important source of funding and economic growth for the economy. And so sometimes there's a bit of these schizophrenic discussions where at the one point we talk about the shadow banking sector, but that is the same sector that should support the economy and could be a source of new funding, of new economic activities. We have seen indeed in the recent past an increase of the non-banking sector, an increased size, for example, of the corporate bond market, an increased activity in the equity IPO sector. Obviously, this holds with this is a rational response, I would say, to the very low interest rate in that we currently have. The extremely low interest rates result in search for yield behavior, looking, for example, for yields in corporate bonds, more risky corporate bonds than the risk-free rate, and trying to, in that way, get a higher yield. And obviously, the increase of the non-banking sector is also, to some extent, a valuation effect. At the moment that the interest rates go down, automatically the valuations of corporate bonds and equities will increase and go up. This is not to say that there is not further work to be done on the non-banking sector in terms of understanding the risks that are developing in this market. We ourselves are trying to get a better understanding, for example, of repo transactions, of securities lending, the activities by asset managers in these areas, and it's very difficult at this stage to get a complete picture of these type of securities finance transactions, and it would be good indeed as regulators would have better tools to get more information on this part of the financial market. Let me then go to a topic which I think is close to your heart and everything that has to do with OTC derivatives. And OTC derivatives and the regulation and supervision of OTC derivatives is probably not as high on the agenda and as publicly advertised as some of the other reforms in the financial markets, but seeing this close by, probably this is one of the biggest changes going on in the financial markets. OTC derivatives were largely unregulated before the crisis, and we're moving now to a quite extensive system of both regulation and supervision of OTC derivatives. I must say that I'm really convinced about this move. I really think it's a good move to make this part of the financial market safer, and both the combination of making it safer by having a CCP in between and moving to central clearing, but also the other part, the other leg, more transparency on OTC derivatives are two important strands that are part of EMIR, part of the G20 commitments, and that we are now seeing in the making. We're now in the middle of this process, and I'm sure that you as treasurers are experiencing this now on a day-to-day basis, preparing for these changes in the derivatives markets. What we have done last year we have made all the technical standards for the CCPs, making requirements regarding their risk management techniques, regarding their controls, regarding margin requirements. That all was finalized and agreed first by the Commission. Well, we made the technical standards, endorsed by the Commission, and subsequently also accepted by the Council and the Parliament. And so all the requirements for the CCPs are now basically completed. And after that, the period started of the authorization of the new CCPs under these new requirements. That started last year. We are now about halfway, so there are about 20 CCPs in the EU that are in the authorization process by the national regulators, but with a college, and in that college the relevant regulators participate, and also ESMA participates. And so that is now in process, and I would expect that by the end of this year all relevant CCPs in the EU, all CCPs in the EU will in principle be under the authorization of EMIR and meet the new requirements. Of course, once you have in order the safety and soundness of the CCPs, they are in principle ready to start clearing products, clearing OTC derivatives, and that part is indeed now also in process. I'm sure that many of you have seen the first consultation papers for the central clearing of interest rate derivatives and certain classes of CDS. We have consulted on that, we got feedback from the stakeholders, and we expect that very soon we will make our technical standards requiring the central clearing in these areas and submit these for endorsement to the European Commission. And I would expect that it's actually a matter of weeks that we will submit that proposal to the European Commission. Of course, subsequently, then there's still a phase-in period, and so the actual effects of the central clearing for the first phase will be, we expect, in the course of next year. In addition to that, many of you will also be involved in the ones that are not centrally cleared, that are still bilaterally cleared. We have published requirements in those areas. There will be also margin standards for the OTC bilaterally cleared derivatives. We have agreed at an international level that we go for an implementation date there for 2015. Finally, very briefly, going back again to the point on stability and the collection of data, we of course also started the whole process of authorizing trade repositories, the trade repositories where the counterparties like you will have to report to, or via your financial intermediary, have to report to the trade repositories. And that is now working. It's not all working perfectly, and so we're working very hard in improving the data quality that is now collected by the trade repositories. Then finally, a few words, and I think in a few minutes we should move to the Q&A session, is the international coordination in general, financial market regulation, and specifically in the area of derivatives. Obviously, financial markets are global, but rules and regulations in the end are still regional, national, and this results in coordination issues, coordination problems. I think the good news is that we have reduced these coordination problems very far with the establishment of first CSR and ESMA. And so you read a lot about the difficult negotiations we're having with our US counterparts. If we wouldn't have an organization like ESMA, we would have had these similar kind of coordination issues between France, Germany, the Netherlands, etc. And so with having now a standard-setting body for financial market regulation in Europe, we have to a large extent solved these coordination problems at a European level. At a worldwide level, this is, of course, much more difficult. I would say, and I would like to argue, that as regulators, we are coordinating extensively. There's a lot of work we're doing together, both with the US regulators and with the Asian counterparts. It's also a reality that a number of very fundamental problems are still there in the legal text. And so regulators can only repair to some extent the coordination issues because of being confronted with problems in the so-called level 1 text in the legislation. And my hobby horse here is to point to the so-called Pittsburgh statement, a G20 statement that resulted in the OTC derivatives reform across the world. The Pittsburgh statement on OTC derivatives was 80 words. And on the basis of these 80 words, the regions started to make their laws and regulations. You know how long EMIR is, you know how long our standards are in EMIR, you know how long Dodd-Frank is. How big is the chance that these independent legal processes come out with the same legal text starting from 80 words in the Pittsburgh Declaration? This is not at all an argument to be complacent, but it's an argument to show how difficult it is to come to a coordinated approach when there are already differences in the underlying legislation. What would help is having more granular standards from the international standard setter. And I think IOSCO has progressed, for example, with having now the standards for the bilateral, the margin standards for bilateral clearing are, for example, much more granular than the earlier standards we had for CCPs. And that is very helpful. The more granular the standards are from the international standard setter, the smaller the chances will be that there will be divergences at a national and regional level. I think it's time to conclude. I've tried to give you an overview of the areas where we are active and I think relevant for you as treasurers. What you can see now is the G20 commitments really getting their effect on the ground floor. But at the same time, I would like to argue it's very important that we take our time for the implementation phase and take our resources. It's also the part where stakeholder interaction is very important. Once you have the high-level legislation, it's very important that the technical standards, that the guidelines, that the Q&As really help in the implementation of the higher-level text, the higher-level legal text. And finally, as you have seen, we have worked on the broader objectives of ESMA. Some of the new responsibilities relate to stability. That has resulted clearly in more data being collected from the securities markets. But again, I would like to emphasize, we need these type of data to make sure that markets do their service in terms of investor protection and in terms of stability. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
I have a question on CCP. When you see the different CCP, you can notice that they have a different interpretation of the standard, EMIR standard, for example, the type of collateral admitted. In terms of supervision, do you think that the coordination by ESMA will be sufficient to be sure of similar methodologies by the different local supervisors on CCP?
What is obviously important, and going back to some of the remarks I've made, we indeed now have the technical standards. We have the law in EMIR, we have the technical standards in EMIR, and I think it's quite elaborate. And we see our role as ESMA in the colleges, and precisely the colleges have the responsibility and the function to ensure supervisory consistency across the CCPs. And so ESMA participates in all the colleges. Some of the national regulators are also participating in multiple colleges. And these activities in the colleges really help in trying to get to a more consistent supervision. I think it's much better, and we are progressing compared to the let's say, the old situation or the previous situation, where things like colleges were not there, where we didn't have the possibilities for, or were not as active with Q&As, and so our colleges work helps in trying to get to more consistent supervision. We use the Q&As to really get to a consistent supervision. We might issue guidelines when needed to get to consistent supervision, and so we really work here trying to get to this more common approach across the regulators. Is that easy? No. Will we complete perfectly this job? No. It's like even within one organization, as you're probably aware, it's already difficult to ensure that all employees, you know, have the same approach when they approach a client or when they do their work. So consistency of approaches is, to some extent, a never-ending story. I'm optimistic that with the new framework, we will be better able than in the past to contribute to consistent supervision. At the same time, there will be new instances coming from inconsistency, and once it's there, we have to work on it.
Richard Rayburn. I chair as you know, the European Association of Corporate Treasurers. And first of all, the good news, I would pay tribute to the implementation of EMIR, at least in one aspect, the details of which I'm completely failing to remember, where we did see a very pragmatic interpretation by your team of what the level 1 legislation would do to the non-financial counterparties, and we appreciated that. Now the sort of the bad news, and I just want to note for the record that, as you know, we have lodged a complaint to the European Ombudsman about the failure to see treasurer representation in your advisory group, and this is not the right forum to debate that, and I'm sure we shouldn't and won't. But I was fascinated by Philippe's run-through of your background, and there were two strands that I took, which will lead to my two questions. I heard diversity and I heard governance. Now, both, I think, are relevant to the question. The first question is, how do we get better level 1 policy setting coming out of Brussels? And what can you do to improve that on our behalf? And I think both of EMIR, I think of CRD and CRR, and I think also, and it's controversial, I know, about the money market fund proposals, in all three of which we've seen huge failures on the part of the Commission and then Parliament to appreciate what it does to what I'm going to call the real economy, what it does to non-financial counterparties. And very often there's a confusion between non-financial counterparties and the overall financial system. And in my view, that lies at the heart of some of the failures. So can ESMA be a strong voice for us in Brussels in trying to change that? That's the first question. And the second one, which does indirectly link to our complaint, how do we get a more pragmatic approach to stakeholder involvement, breaking away, I would hope, within the constraints under which I know you have to operate from the rules that are laid down for you by Brussels? And I would merely note, and many people in this room probably don't know this, but your advisory group of 30 people consists of 8 academics, 4 shareholder trade association representatives, and the balance, I think I'm right in saying, is essentially financial market representatives. And to me, that gives entirely the wrong message about the ability of ESMA to benefit from the advice that those people actually deal with the nuts and bolts of the financial system, managing their company's liquidity and risk, and occasionally doing issues, how their views are properly represented in the rulemaking that you're responsible for.
Thank you very much, Richard, for these comments. A few reactions. Well, you know, I think I should not be the person judging the quality of rules making and in Europe. I think if you want to change that, I would say we're all voters. We can all vote in elections, and that is the way to make changes. The way to make changes is making sure that if you are concerned, and the way to express your concerns about the policy making in Europe is to let your voice heard when there is election time. And of course there are other ways to express your views to politicians, and I'm sure also Richard will use these avenues. Being more to the point, we see our role as regulators, as technicians, to indeed also advise the politicians. We advise the politicians on the very complex technical rules and regulations on which the parliamentarians, council and the commission have to decide and are working. And so regularly we give advice to the Commission, to the Parliament and the Council on certain pieces of legislation where, from our technician perspective, it can be improved. And so if you go back to our track record in the past years, we have sent many letters both to the Presidency, to Michel Barnier, and also to the European Parliament on issues where we think the legislation can be improved and can benefit from the views from the technicians, and we have shared that with the political side. And I think it's a classical role for the securities regulators to advise the political side on the basis of their expertise on certain pieces of legislation which are in process. Then on the representation side, there I would say we try to be as open as possible and to be as and reach out to all the relevant stakeholders. The problem is Europe is very big. The problem is Europe is very diversified. And so whenever you would make a certain cross-section, you would probably be able to find that there are some certain countries are lacking, or a certain gender is lacking, or a certain group is lacking. We really sincerely do our best to do it in an objective way and try to get the interest there. I should say there, this is not only about the securities market stakeholder group at ESMA level, it's also about the consultative working groups, and it is also about submitting your consultation reactions to ESMA when we have a consultation, and also there are options and possibilities for personal interactions with staff on when it's appropriate and a certain point in time. I can only encourage treasurers to be part of that. We have encouraged treasurers to be part of our processes and be involved, and I think it's important indeed that treasurers make their contributions to our processes. Other question?
You insisted on the importance of collecting data to have appropriate regulation. And as you said, EMIR is still in its early stage of implementation. However, do you consider that with EMIR, you have already collected interesting data. On the corporate side, we should say that we're still surprised that when we report deals under EMIR, they often come back with an unmatched status from the trade repositories, which leaves us wondering what you can do with all this unreconciled information. Thank you.
No, I think it's a very good question on the quality of the data and the trade repositories. This goes back to the point that we are collecting these data because of getting a better view on the risks in OTC derivatives markets. We started in February this year with collecting these data and with the obligation for the counterparties to report. I think it's no secret that we would have preferred a later start date to be prepared for that moment. I think you can see the correspondence with the European Commission where we prefer to have a later start date for the collection of data. There are indeed quality issues, and we're working very hard now with both the trade repositories themselves to increase the quality of the data, and also both with ESMA and also together with the national regulators to ensure that the data quality improves. And indeed, we have observed the non-matching of the legs of the same transaction. Obviously, that is a problem. It needs to be the case that when the two legs report, that somehow in the system they find each other. Otherwise, there is a problem with the identifier of that transaction. I can assure you that we are working on that very hard, together with the supervisory team within ESMA, trying to improve that. We think we already have made good steps there, but we're not yet at the end of that process of improving the quality of the data. There's a question there.
Armel Poulou, EDF. A consequence of OTC regulation has been that the cost and the complexity of putting an edge for a corporate has been increasing quite substantially. Don't you think that it could discourage some small corporates and more fragile corporates to enter into hedging and having a bad effect?
If I understand your question correctly, you're concerned about the complexity of the new system for the smaller corporates of the OTC derivatives. I think what I would, well, first of all, I'm a true believer in moving to central clearing and going to more transparency. So I think that is the main thrust which in the direction where we should go. At the same time, we understand, and the legislators have understood, that this might be indeed taxing or costly for especially the non-financial corporates. And as you probably are aware, there are quite extensive exemptions under under EMIR for the non-financials. And all OTC derivatives which are used for, let's say, for business purposes, which are not using for speculative reasons, which are used for hedging, and I don't have the precise wording here, so you need to go back to the legal text to have it precise. But if you are doing derivatives or enter into derivatives contracts because of business reasons, because of hedging reasons, they are excluded from EMIR in terms of the central clearing requirement. There will indeed be the requirement, for example, regarding reconciliation, etc., but they are exempted from the central clearing requirement. And even if you use them for speculative reasons, then there are quite generous exemptions, I think of a couple of billion in total for all categories, taking the various categories of OTC derivatives together. So indeed, there is no exemption in that respect for the financial reporting side. For some of there will be the requirements for the bilateral ones, but there are the exemptions regarding the central clearing. Of course, in the end, this relates to making sure that the market is safer. If we can make it more streamlined, if we can make it more efficient, we might at a certain point in time revise our technical standards based on the feedback that we're getting from the stakeholders and saying, this is not very practical. We have now worked with this technical standard. Can we do this more efficiently? We're certainly willing to consider to revise a technical standard. That is precisely the purpose of having a technical standard and not having it in a law, so you can adapt it when needed. And so if during, over time, when we do the implementation and we can see that we can improve in terms of efficiency or making them more streamlined, these technical standards, we can consider that when needed.
Edouard de Langzin from European Institute of Financial Regulation. We spoke a lot about regulation, but I think the other key domain on which we have to dig a little more is supervision. And especially after this crisis, we observe a lack of trust between supervisors inside Europe and from Europe and outside Europe. What type of initiative ESMA can take? First, to create a level playing field between supervisors in Europe and to be sure that all the supervisors in Europe are more or less at the same level of efficiency. And second, how we would convince the Americans that the level of supervision as Europe is at least as good as there, or even better. Because if not, temptation is about extraterritorialities, and as you know, extraterritorialities is not efficient and it's a source of new risks.
First, thank you for the two questions, both on the consistency of supervision at the European level and at a worldwide level. I think first moving to the European level, obviously the agenda of ESMA in the past years has been, there's been a strong focus on the single rule book because we're in the middle of the phase of the regulatory reform, and I think it's no secret to say that there has been especially an emphasis on delivering the technical standards on the short selling regulation, on AMIR, on credit rating agencies, etc. And so the rulebook side has dominated the agenda, and I would hope and I think we will be able to have a gradual shift in the activities of ESMA together with the national regulators to put supervisory convergence higher on the agenda. And of course, it's a very wide range of instruments that we're using to make sure that we get to consistent supervision, varying from the colleges that we just discussed, the Q&As that we regularly publish. We have many Q&As on AMIR. We will do the same for MiFID, and in some areas we also have guidelines to ensure this level playing field and getting more to consistent supervision. We're also having our peer review activities, and I would expect that we can free up resources in ESMA, and it goes back to my main point in my talk about it's now time to implement and take time for the implementation, precisely referring to the point of consistent supervision. So I expect that indeed the single rulebook, of course, there still will be a lot of single rulebook in the coming year with MiFID, but over time you would expect that also ESMA's agenda goes more in the direction of supervisory convergence, and that gets will be a bigger piece of our activity. Then on the convincing the Americans, I think both the European Commission and we and the national regulators involved, I think we have put so much energy in trying to convince the Americans to go to a system of mutual reliance and mutual recognitions. But I must say it is a very tall order. It's not very easy. As you know, we in Europe have the philosophy and the approach that in principle third country players that are active in Europe and transactions with third countries should meet the European requirements, and that all relates to the level playing field. So a CCP which provides a US CCP or a CCP from Asia that is providing services for the EU should in principle meet the same regulatory requirements as a European CCP. However, if the foreign system meets the same requirements, if it reaches the same outcomes, we're in principle willing to rely on that system. ESMA has, in that cooperative spirit, published also its equivalence advice to the Commission last year, and I think quite practical way forwards to rely on third countries. But indeed, it's also important that the third countries rely on us, and that is also part of the assessment. And I must say, it is a difficult task. The progress is slow. and we're clearly not yet there.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Maijoor, for your speech, and especially for your, I would say, balanced analysis of the shadow banking topic. I'm Stephen Genin from the French Asset Management Association, AFG. My question regards the issue of the third country passports, because it's a new issue, I would say, in the recently adopted directives. It was first introduced by the AIFMD directive, and I think potentially more importantly in the future, the third country passport introduced in the recently adopted MiFID will be very important as well for European players. So it's a growing topic. I have one question to know where you are today regarding the AIFMD directive third country passports, both for third country managers and third country investment funds. Knowing that there is a deep concern in Europe from a European side about the requirement for the same rules to be complied with by third country players when they might be allowed to enter the single market. So where are you in your analysis of the possibility of requiring the same requirements for third country managers competing with European managers when they will enter the single market? And so do you intend potentially to allow for such a third country passport regime next year, knowing that you are supposed to report to the European Commission and the European Parliament on this possibility of this third country passport for AIFMD, and knowing that afterwards your position might pave the way either negatively or positively for extending that principle to other directives, maybe?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And for those of you who are a bit less close to the asset management issues, as you know, there's in asset management, there is the frequent use of a passporting system. We first had it with the UCITS. I think it's one of the successes, by the way, of rules and regulations. I think the UCITS has been a strong brand name, allowing this passporting system. So once you are vetted or authorized in one member state, in principle, without barriers, you can enter other member states. And I think the passporting system has worked well in the UCITS area, and it's now also introduced for AFMD. As you rightly say, we have now the passporting system for hedge funds and private equity under the AFMD at the European level, but we don't have it yet, a passporting system for a third country outside hedge funds or private equity that would like to conduct activities in the EU. That is on the table, that will be on the table in the sense is, should we also have this possibility for a passport for a private equity or hedge fund coming from Asia or the US? Because currently they need to oblige by the national rules, and if they want to do business in Europe, they need in principle need to go to every 28 member states. We will start that looking into this issue in the coming months. I expect that we will have the first consultations on this issue before the year end, before Christmas, before New Year's Eve. There will be the first consultations on this passporting system, with indeed the objective to deliver advice to the Commission in the course of next year, and then it's up to the Commission to take a decision on this issue. On the principle, and I think you emphasize very much the possibility for third country private equity and hedge funds to do business in Europe. In principle, of course, we are very much in favor, and that is also very much reflected in the European legislation of global markets in derivatives, global markets in asset management. So in principle, you are in favor of indeed allowing third countries to passport into Europe, and once they are passported, they do their business across the 28. However, and so we need to assess that and how it works, etc. But in general, I think considering the philosophy of global markets and making sure that they globally work, you would like to have a system where the passporting works. But also in this assessment, part of the assessment will be an element that we need to assess to what extent does the third country open up the possibility for EU hedge funds and private equity to do business in that third country. And it's envisaged and it's possible that, for example, for that reason, countries are excluded. And it's the same issue or the same problem we just talked about the OTC derivatives element. We, in principle, see ways forward to rely on the US, but an essential part of the assessment is also to what extent is the US willing to rely on the EU, and to some extent a similar mechanism will be part of the passporting assessment for third countries under the AFMD.
Michel Prada. It is the privilege of a veteran to witness the progress or slow development of these issues. And when looking backwards, it's quite remarkable that we started in the mid-90s with nothing, and we end up today with a quite remarkable set of harmonized rules, standards, and an organization that has developed hugely. My question is, now that you are expecting a new commission and a new parliament, what would be your expectations or demands?
Well, thank you very much for sharing, Michel, your observations on the changes. And I think it's quite remarkable what has been achieved, not only in the past 3 years, but also going back to the 90s and the progress. So I think that is very good. What will be maybe first on ESMA itself, and then maybe going to securities markets. First on ESMA itself, it goes back to my point on the implementation side. We need our resources, and I think there were questions about how can we ensure supervisory consistency across the EU. That is a task that requires resources. It's a task that requires time. And currently we have a funding model for the ESAs and for ESMA where €1 more for the ESMA is €1 less for the national supervisors, which I think is a very twisted and unhelpful funding model, because the reality, most of the regulatory reform concerns both changes at European level and at national level. So I think one issue that we really need to progress on is take implementation seriously, and to take it seriously you need resources. This is not to ask for a large bureaucratic organization, but you all understand if we want to progress on the agenda of supervisory consistency, we need to have the resources to work on that. I think that is a very important element talking about ESMA. There's a whole range of other ones that are on the table. Fabrice de Marigny has been leading a report for the European Parliament with proposals for changes to the ESAs. The same has come out from the European Commission report recently. There's a whole range of areas where I think the ESAs can improve. And as I just said, the resourcing is one I would like to mention. One other that I would like to mention is the flexibility of use of technical standards, and especially apply that to the AMIR era. One of the problems we see in AMIR is that we take the central clearing decision through a technical standard. And a technical standard requires about 9 months to implement it, and to change it probably will also require about that time. That is much too long to take a decision when markets dry up. We will have to take similar decisions regarding transparency requirements for bonds. We should have quicker, faster instruments to take a decision on things like central clearing and transparency requirements. And so there's a whole range of things we would like to ask for. Two that I would like to mention, resources, and the other one, flexibility in the measures that we can take, and especially the example, I think, of OTC derivatives clearing, central clearing, but also transparency requirements for bond markets would be an example. I think on the broader issues, obviously, whoever, and I think we'll hear it later today if I understand the timetabling of Mr. Juncker correctly, we will hear who's going to be there. I think who's ever going to be there, what will be very clear is the issue of growth. how will we manage growth, and managing the relationship between regulation and supervision and growth. And I think sometimes there is this, and I won't defend all financial market regulation. There's going to be rules and regulations implemented in the past years that we need to revise because they were not the right ones. With such a big regulatory reform, it's bound that there are some that are just not good laws and regulations and that need to be changed. That is the experience that we have. At the same time, the philosophy of regulation should be and is, and it's also we are there for the well-functioning of markets. Regulations and supervisors are not there as a brake on the economy or as a brake on the financial markets. We are there to make sure that the markets work. And just to, I know it's the standard response, but see how much economic growth we have lost because of the financial crisis and because of poor regulation. We are now more than half a gross national product away from the growth path we were on before the crisis. And so I don't, at the one hand, I will not defend every individual part of each regulation. We need to look at them, we need to evaluate them, and as I said earlier, where ESMA itself can do its job is by looking at the technical standards, and if they can be better, we should revise them. But at the same time, rules and regulations are there for the well-functioning of financial markets, and I think one of the issues which will be high on our agenda for the coming weeks, coming months, and coming year is how you combine the idea of growth and regulation and supervision. At the same time, to some extent, it is a artificial contradiction because the role of rules of supervision is to make sure that they are viable, that they are healthy, and that financial markets can provide a role in the economy as required. I think that was probably the last question. One more quick one, or is this? I think we need to finalize. I think that was the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Okay. Chairman, I would like just to thank you very much on behalf of all attendees to have been with us today and to share your views about regulation, about all the job made by your team. And at the same time, I'd like just to wish that as we are Group Treasurer Associations, to be maybe more involved in your works. So again, we are at your disposal if you need help and maybe more pragmatism in the regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.